In the rolling hills of southeastern Ohio, where the Hocking River winds through forgotten valleys, stands a weathered stone marker that most locals avoid after dark. The inscription, barely legible after decades of harsh winters, reads simply, New Canaan Community Farm, 1837-1863. In God's grace we trust. What it doesn't mention is the 234 souls who died on that land, or why the Coleman family barn still echoes with sounds that have no earthly source on windless nights. For over a century and a half, the descendants of Athens County have kept this story buried, speaking of it only in whispers passed down through generations. Tonight, for the first time, the complete truth about Elder Daniel Coleman and his family's 26-year reign of terror will be revealed. A truth so disturbing that it challenges everything we thought we knew about faith, family, and the American frontier. Before we continue with the story of the Coleman family and their community that promised salvation but delivered only suffering, I need to know, are you one of the brave souls who can handle the darkest chapters of American history? This channel isn't for everyone, only for those who dare to uncover the truth that others fear to speak. If you're ready to join our brotherhood of mystery seekers, hit that subscribe button now and tell me in the comments what state you're listening from, because what happened in Ohio could have happened anywhere in frontier America. Let's discover together what lurks beneath the surface of our nation's forgotten past. The year was 1837, and America was hungry for salvation. The Second Great Awakening had swept across the frontier like wildfire, leaving countless souls searching for a more perfect union with the divine. Athens County, Ohio, in the winter of 1837, was a land caught between civilization and wilderness. The Ohio River trade routes had brought prosperity to some, but the rolling hills and dense forests still harbored secrets that daylight couldn't illuminate. Small farming communities dotted the landscape, connected by muddy roads that turned treacherous with the first frost. It was here, in a valley sheltered by ancient oak trees, that Elder Daniel Coleman first laid eyes on the 400 acres that would become his kingdom of horrors. Coleman was a striking figure, tall with piercing blue eyes and a voice that could make sinners weep and saints question their faith. At 42, he had already buried 2 wives and claimed to receive visions directly from the Almighty. His current wife, Sarah, whom he called Mother Sarah in public, was 20 years his junior, but carried herself with the stern authority of a woman twice her age. Their 3 children, 16-year-old Joshua, 14-year-old Rebecca, and 12-year-old Ezra, had been raised to view their father not just as a parent, but as God's chosen vessel on earth. The Coleman family had arrived in Athens County with a wagon full of gold coins, claiming to be fleeing religious persecution in Pennsylvania. Daniel's story was compelling. He spoke of corrupt church leaders, of communities that had lost their way, of God's call to establish a new Eden where the faithful could live in perfect harmony. He had purchased the land with cash, an unusual transaction that raised eyebrows among the locals, but was quickly forgotten when Daniel began offering employment to anyone willing to work his fields. The property itself seemed almost too perfect for Coleman's purposes. The main house, a 2-story brick structure with thick walls and small windows, sat on a hill overlooking the valley. Below, the land stretched in all directions, fertile fields for crops, dense woodlands for lumber, and a clear stream that provided fresh water year-round. Most importantly, the property was isolated, surrounded by miles of forest that would muffle any sounds that might disturb the neighboring farms. Within months of his arrival, Daniel Coleman had begun advertising in newspapers across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. His message was simple but compelling. Join the New Canaan Community Farm, where Christian families live in perfect harmony with God's will. No worldly possessions required, only faith, willing hands, and a desire to serve the Lord. The advertisements promised communal living, shared prosperity, and most appealing of all, guaranteed salvation for those who proved themselves worthy. The first families began arriving in the spring of 1838. The Hendersons came from a failing farm in Pennsylvania, bringing their 4 children and everything they owned in a single wagon. The Millers followed 2 weeks later, then the Washingtons, the Thompsons, and the Prices. Each family was greeted personally by Elder Coleman, who spoke with such conviction about God's plan for their community that even the most skeptical found themselves believing. What these families didn't know was that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap. Daniel Coleman had spent years perfecting his methods, studying the weaknesses of desperate people and the ways that faith could be weaponized against the faithful. The New Canaan Community Farm was not a religious sanctuary. It was a labor camp disguised as paradise, and the Coleman family were its merciless wardens. The early days seemed to fulfill Coleman's promises. Families lived in well-built cabins, shared meals in the common dining hall, and gathered each evening for prayer and Bible study. The work was hard, clearing fields, planting crops, building structures, but it felt meaningful. Coleman himself worked alongside the community members, his sleeves rolled up, his hands dirty with honest labor. He spoke often of the biblical precedent for their lifestyle, citing the early Christians who held all things in common and lived as one family under God. But as the months passed, subtle changes began to transform the community. The workdays grew longer, the meals smaller, the punishments for minor infractions more severe. Coleman explained these changes as necessary steps toward spiritual purification. The flesh must be weakened, he would say, so that the spirit may grow strong. Those who questioned his methods were subjected to public confessions, forced to admit their spiritual weakness before the entire community. The first death came in the autumn of 1838, just 6 months after the community's founding. Thomas Henderson, the father who had brought his family from Pennsylvania with such hope, collapsed while clearing stumps from the north field. The official cause, according to Elder Coleman's careful records, was heart failure brought on by the joy of serving the Lord. But Martha Henderson, Thomas's widow, whispered to her children that her husband had been working 16-hour days with nothing but thin soup and stale bread to sustain him. The funeral was held at sunset, with the entire community gathered around a simple grave marked only with a wooden cross. Coleman delivered a sermon that lasted nearly 3 hours, speaking of Thomas Henderson's blessed transition to eternal life and the privilege the community had been given to witness such divine favor. "Brother Thomas has been called home," Coleman declared, his voice carrying across the valley like thunder. "He has shown us the path to glory, and we must follow his example of total surrender to God's will." But as the weeks passed, more members of the community began to notice disturbing patterns. The Coleman family, Daniel, Sarah, and their 3 children, never seemed to suffer from the same exhaustion that plagued everyone else. They ate their meals separately, in the main house, while the rest of the community gathered in the drafty common hall. Their clothes were always clean and well-mended, while the other families wore increasingly ragged garments that were never replaced. Most troubling of all were the nighttime sounds that began to echo from the main house. Community members sleeping in the nearest cabins reported hearing what sounded like laughter, music, and the clinking of fine china. Sounds that seemed impossible given the austere lifestyle Coleman preached. When questioned about these reports, Coleman would fix the inquirer with his piercing blue eyes and speak of the spiritual rewards that came to those who had fully surrendered their earthly desires. The second death came in December, when Mary Washington, a young mother of 3, was found frozen in her bed. The cabin she shared with her family had run out of firewood 2 days earlier, and their request for more had been denied by Joshua Coleman, who managed the community's supplies. "Sister Mary has been taken by the Lord's mercy," Elder Coleman announced at her funeral. "She has been spared the trials that yet await us all." By the end of that first winter, 7 members of the New Canaan community had died. Each death was explained as divine providence. Each funeral became an opportunity for Coleman to reinforce his control over the survivors. The community members were forbidden from communicating with the outside world, their letters carefully censored by Rebecca Coleman, who claimed to be protecting them from worldly influences that might weaken their faith. But it was the discovery made by young Peter Miller that would reveal the true horror of what was happening at New Canaan. Peter was only 14, but he had been raised on a farm and knew the difference between natural death and something far more sinister. While cleaning the community's root cellar, he had found a collection of personal items, watches, jewelry, family Bibles, and photographs that had belonged to the deceased members. These were items that should have been sent to relatives or buried with the dead, not hoarded like treasure in a hidden chamber beneath the Coleman house. When Peter tried to report his discovery to Elder Coleman, he was told that he would need to undergo a spiritual cleansing for his impure thoughts. That night, Peter Miller disappeared. The official story was that he had run away, unable to handle the discipline required for true spiritual growth. But his mother, Elizabeth Miller, found drops of blood leading from Peter's cabin to the woods behind the main house, and she knew her son had not left voluntarily. The pattern was becoming clear to those brave enough to see it. The New Canaan community farm was not a religious sanctuary. It was a prison where the Coleman family grew rich while their brothers and sisters died from deliberate neglect, overwork, and worse. But for those trapped within its boundaries, escape seemed impossible. The nearest town was 15 miles away through dangerous woods, and Coleman had convinced them that the outside world was filled with demons waiting to destroy their souls. As 1839 dawned, the survivors of that first brutal winter found themselves trapped in a routine of exhausting labor and spiritual manipulation that would define the next 24 years of their lives. The community had grown to over 200 souls, with new families arriving each spring drawn by Coleman's carefully crafted advertisements. But the death toll continued to mount, and those who had survived began to develop a haunted look that spoke of horrors beyond description. The Coleman family had established a rigid hierarchy within the community. Elder Daniel remained the unquestioned leader, his word treated as divine law. Mother Sarah oversaw the women's work, managing the kitchens, laundry, and childcare with an iron fist that left permanent marks on those who dared to question her authority. Joshua Coleman, now 17 and growing into his father's image, controlled the community's supplies and work assignments. Rebecca, 15 and beautiful in the way that draws dangerous attention, served as her father's secretary and enforcer, while young Ezra, only 13 but already showing signs of the family's cruel nature, was being groomed to take over the community's expanding operations. The main house had been expanded twice, with new wings added to accommodate the Coleman family's growing wealth and power. The original structure now served as their private quarters, while the additions housed Coleman's office, a room where community members were brought for private counseling that often left them broken and terrified. The basement had been converted into a series of chambers that the Colemans claimed were for food storage, but the community members whispered that sounds of suffering echoed from below ground on certain nights. The work routine was designed to break both body and spirit. Community members were awakened at 4 a.m. with the ringing of a bell that Sarah Coleman controlled from her bedroom window. By 4:30 they were expected to be at their assigned tasks, men in the fields or workshops, women in the kitchens or laundry, children as young as 8 helping with whatever work their small hands could manage. The only break came at noon, when they were allowed 30 minutes to eat a meager meal of watery soup and hard bread. But it was the evening services that truly revealed the depth of Coleman's psychological control. Each night, the entire community was required to gather in the main hall for what Coleman called spiritual instruction. These sessions often lasted until midnight, with Coleman delivering sermons that mixed legitimate biblical passages with his own twisted interpretations. Community members were required to confess their sins publicly, to admit their failures, and beg for forgiveness from both God and Elder Coleman. Those who showed signs of rebellion were subjected to special attention. They might be assigned to work parties that never returned, sent on missionary work to distant towns, or simply disappear during the night. The official explanations varied. Some had been called to serve the Lord in other places. Others had succumbed to worldly temptations and fled like cowards. But the community members knew better. They had learned to recognize the signs that preceded these disappearances: the private meetings with Coleman, the sudden assignment to isolated work details, the way the person's name would be mentioned with increasing frequency during the evening services. The children born in the community faced a particularly horrific fate. Those who showed promise were taken from their parents at age 5 and raised directly by the Coleman family, trained to become the next generation of overseers. The others were put to work as soon as they could walk, their small hands perfect for tasks that adults couldn't manage. Many of these children never lived to see their 10th birthday, their bodies too small to handle the brutal conditions Coleman imposed. By 1845, the New Canaan Community Farm had become a self-sustaining operation of horror. The community produced crops that were sold in distant markets, bringing steady income to the Coleman family. They raised livestock that fed the family while the workers survived on scraps. They even operated a small mill that processed grain for neighboring farms, with the profits going directly into Daniel Coleman's ever-growing collection of gold coins. But the most profitable aspect of the operation was the constant stream of new arrivals. Each family brought their life savings, their livestock, their tools, and their hope. Coleman had perfected the art of extracting every penny from these newcomers before they realized the trap they had entered. By the time they understood their situation, they were too weak, too isolated, and too psychologically broken to resist. The nearest town, Athens, was far enough away that the community's activities remained hidden from prying eyes. When occasional visitors did arrive, traveling preachers, government officials, or relatives of community members, they were given carefully orchestrated tours that showed only what Coleman wanted them to see. The healthiest community members were brought forward to testify about their spiritual fulfillment, while the sick and starving were hidden away in the back cabins or sent to work in distant fields. Local authorities received regular reports from Coleman about the community's activities, always written in his own hand and presenting a picture of peaceful religious devotion. The few complaints that reached the outside world were dismissed as the ramblings of troubled individuals who had been unable to handle the discipline required for true spiritual growth. Coleman's reputation as a man of God, combined with his careful cultivation of relationships with local politicians and business leaders, created a shield of protection around the New Canaan community that seemed impenetrable. The winter of 1851 brought changes that would test even Coleman's iron control over his captive community. A severe outbreak of influenza swept through the overcrowded cabins, killing 37 people in less than 2 months. But it was during this crisis that a few brave souls began to piece together the full scope of the Coleman family's crimes. Anna Thompson, a widow who had arrived with her 2 children 3 years earlier, had been assigned to help care for the sick. Her nursing duties gave her access to cabins throughout the community, and what she discovered made her blood run cold. The influenza outbreak was not natural. It was being deliberately spread by Rebecca Coleman, who had been visiting the sick with contaminated blankets and food. Anna watched in horror as the 19-year-old girl moved from cabin to cabin, her beautiful face a mask of calculated cruelty, as she ensured that the weakest members of the community would not survive the winter. But Anna's most shocking discovery came when she was assigned to clean out the cabin of the recently deceased Williams family. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, she found a journal that had been kept by Robert Williams, a former schoolteacher who had documented everything he had witnessed during his 2 years at New Canaan. The journal's pages revealed a pattern of systematic murder, theft, and abuse that made Anna's hands shake as she read. Williams had recorded dates, names, and methods. He had documented how food was deliberately withheld from families who showed signs of discontent, how accidents befell those who asked too many questions, and how the Coleman family had amassed a fortune built on the blood and suffering of their followers. Most disturbing of all, Williams had discovered that several community members had not died from natural causes, but had been poisoned with a substance that mimicked the symptoms of common illnesses. The journal also revealed that Daniel Coleman was not the man he claimed to be. His real name was David Colton, and he had been wanted by authorities in 3 states for fraud and murder. The deaths of his previous wives had not been natural, and the religious persecution he claimed to have fled was actually a murder warrant issued after the suspicious death of a wealthy widow who had left him her entire estate. Anna Thompson faced an impossible choice. She could try to expose the truth and almost certainly be killed for her efforts, or she could remain silent and watch as more innocent people died. The decision was made for her when she realized that Rebecca Coleman had been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate another potential threat. The confrontation came during a particularly brutal February blizzard. Anna had been summoned to the main house for what Rebecca called spiritual counseling. But instead of the usual psychological manipulation, Anna found herself face to face with the true nature of the Coleman family's operation. The basement chambers she had heard whispered about were revealed to be torture rooms where dissidents were broken physically and mentally before being quietly eliminated. Rebecca Coleman, now 22 and fully initiated into her family's methods, explained to Anna exactly what would happen to her and her children if she tried to expose the truth. "You have seen too much," Rebecca said, her voice as cold as the winter wind howling outside. "But you are not the first, and you will not be the last. The choice is simple. Join us in our work, or join the others in their eternal rest." But Anna Thompson had one advantage that Rebecca had not anticipated. During her nursing duties, she had earned the trust of other community members who were beginning to question their situation. Margaret Foster, whose husband had died under suspicious circumstances the previous year, had been keeping her own record of the community's activities. David Chen, one of the few skilled craftsmen in the community, had been gathering evidence of the Coleman family's theft and extortion. Sarah Martinez, a young mother whose children had been taken for special education, had been planning her own escape. This small group of conspirators had been meeting in secret, using the cover of their work duties to share information and plan their response. They had discovered that the Coleman family's wealth was hidden in a series of caches throughout the property, that several community members were being held prisoner in the basement chambers, and that a mass murder was being planned for the spring of 1852 to eliminate the witnesses to the family's crimes. The revelation that shocked them most was the discovery that the Coleman family had been operating similar communities in other states. Joshua Coleman, now 25 and his father's primary assistant, had been traveling regularly to establish new branches of their operation. The New Canaan Community Farm was not an isolated horror. It was part of a network of religious communities that existed solely to enrich the Coleman family through exploitation and murder. The spring of 1852 brought with it a sense of impending doom that even the most obedient community members could not ignore. The Coleman family had grown more brazen in their cruelty, more careless in their methods, and more desperate to maintain their control. The community population had swelled to nearly 400 souls, but the death toll had increased proportionally. The small cemetery behind the main house now contained over 100 graves, each marked with a simple wooden cross that bore no name. Anna Thompson and her fellow conspirators had spent the winter months carefully gathering evidence and planning their escape. They had discovered that the Coleman family was planning what they called the Great Purification, a mass elimination of community members who were no longer productive or who posed potential threats. The plan was to blame the deaths on a disease outbreak, dispose of the bodies in a mass grave, and start fresh with a new group of unsuspecting victims. But their plans for escape were complicated by the arrival of a new group of families in early March. The Andersons, the Kellys, the Johnsons, and the Moores had come from as far away as Virginia, drawn by Coleman's latest advertising campaign. These newcomers represented fresh victims who had no idea of the horrors that awaited them, and Anna's group felt morally obligated to try to save them along with themselves. The situation became even more dangerous when Ezra Coleman, now 25 and fully initiated into his family's methods, began to suspect that someone was gathering evidence against them. He had always been the most unstable member of the family, prone to violent outbursts and paranoid delusions. His suspicions fell first on Anna Thompson, whose nursing duties had given her access to too much information, and then on the other members of her secret group. The first sign of trouble came when Margaret Foster's youngest child, 8-year-old Emma, disappeared during a routine work detail. The official explanation was that she had wandered off and gotten lost in the woods, but Margaret knew better. Emma had been taken as leverage, a way to ensure Margaret's silence about what she had discovered. The message was clear: cooperate or watch your children die. This escalation forced Anna's group to accelerate their plans. They had originally hoped to gather enough evidence to present to outside authorities, but it was becoming clear that they would not have that luxury. The Coleman family was preparing for their final solution, and the conspirators had only days to act. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Timothy Walsh, a 15-year-old boy who had been born in the community, approached Anna with information that changed everything. Timothy had been working in the Coleman family's private quarters, and he had overheard conversations that revealed the full scope of their plans. The Great Purification was scheduled for the first week of April during the community's annual spring festival. The Coleman family would use poisoned food to kill most of the community members, then burn the buildings to destroy the evidence. But Timothy's information also revealed something even more shocking. The Coleman family had been in contact with similar operations in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana. They were planning to abandon the Ohio location and move to a new site where they could start the process all over again. The deaths of the new Canaan community members were not just about eliminating witnesses. They were about covering the tracks of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over a decade. The conspirators now faced their greatest challenge yet. They had to find a way to save not just themselves, but hundreds of innocent people who had no idea of the danger they were in. They had to do it without alerting the Coleman family to their plans, and they had to do it quickly enough to prevent the mass murder that was only weeks away. The solution came from David Chen, whose carpentry skills had given him detailed knowledge of the community's layout and the Coleman family's security measures. He had discovered that the basement chambers beneath the main house were not just torture rooms. They were also the storage site for the Coleman family's accumulated wealth. Years of theft and extortion had filled these chambers with gold coins, jewelry, and other valuables taken from their victims. Chen's plan was audacious in its simplicity. The conspirators would use the cover of the Spring Festival preparations to access the basement chambers, gather evidence of the family's crimes, and steal enough of their wealth to fund an escape. They would then slip away during the chaos of the festival, taking with them as many community members as possible and heading for the nearest town where they could alert the authorities. But as they prepared to put their plan into action, they discovered that they were not the only ones with secrets. The Coleman family had been monitoring their activities more closely than they realized, and a trap was being prepared that would test their courage and their commitment to saving the innocent souls who had placed their trust in a family of monsters. The stakes had never been higher, and the window for action was rapidly closing. In just 2 weeks, the Spring Festival would begin, and with it, the Coleman family's plan to eliminate the evidence of their crimes, along with the lives of everyone who had witnessed them. The question was no longer whether the conspirators could escape. It was whether they could save anyone else in the process. The night of April 5th, 1852, would be remembered as the longest night in the history of Athens County. The Spring Festival had begun 3 days earlier, with the entire community gathered for what they believed would be a celebration of renewal and spiritual rebirth. But as the sun set on that cold April evening, Anna Thompson and her fellow conspirators knew that they were about to face the greatest test of their lives. The Coleman family had been behaving strangely all week. Daniel Coleman's usual commanding presence seemed forced, his sermons more desperate than inspiring. Sarah Coleman had been seen burning papers in the main house's fireplace, while Rebecca and Joshua moved through the community with a nervous energy that spoke of impending violence. Most troubling of all, Ezra Coleman had been seen sharpening knives in the family's private workshop, his eyes holding the wild gleam of a man who had finally been given permission to indulge his darkest impulses. The festival's final feast was scheduled for that evening, with the entire community gathering in the main hall for what Coleman had promised would be a transformative experience. But Anna and her conspirators knew that this feast would be the vehicle for the mass poisoning that would eliminate most of the community members. They had spent the day making final preparations, gathering supplies, and positioning themselves to act when the moment came. The plan was set into motion at sunset. While the community members filed into the main hall for the feast, Anna Thompson and David Chen slipped away to the basement chambers beneath the Coleman house. Their mission was to gather evidence of the family's crimes and steal enough of their wealth to fund an escape for the survivors. Meanwhile, Margaret Foster and Sarah Martinez positioned themselves near the exits, ready to guide community members to safety when the alarm was raised. The basement chambers were even more horrifying than Anna had imagined. The walls were lined with wooden crates filled with personal belongings taken from the dead: wedding rings, family photographs, children's toys, and other mementos of lives cut short. In the center of the largest chamber sat a massive iron safe, its door standing open to reveal stacks of gold coins and jewelry that represented the life savings of hundreds of victims. But it was the discovery in the final chamber that truly revealed the depth of the Coleman family's evil. Here, in a room lit by flickering candles, Anna found detailed records of every person who had ever entered the New Canaan community. Each entry included their name, their family members, their possessions, and the method by which they had been eliminated. The records went back 15 years and covered not just the Ohio location, but similar operations in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Kentucky. The most shocking revelation was the discovery that the Coleman family had been selling some of their victims into slavery. Young women and children who had shown signs of resistance were not killed. They were drugged, loaded onto wagons, and transported to buyers in the Deep South. The records showed that over 60 people had been sold in this manner. Their families told that they had died from various illnesses. But as Anna and David gathered the evidence, they realized that they had walked into a trap. The basement chambers were not just storage rooms, they were also a prison. The sound of footsteps on the stairs above them was followed by the grinding of metal as the heavy door at the top of the stairs was locked from the outside. They were trapped. And somewhere above them, the mass murder of their friends and neighbors was about to begin. The feast in the main hall had begun with Coleman's longest sermon yet, a rambling discourse about the necessity of sacrifice and the purification of the faithful. But as the evening progressed, the community members began to notice that something was wrong. The food tasted strange, bitter with an aftertaste that lingered long after each bite. Some people began to feel dizzy, others complained of stomach pains, and a few of the older members started to collapse. It was Timothy Walsh who first raised the alarm. The 15-year-old had been watching from the kitchen, and he had seen Rebecca Coleman adding a white powder to the serving pots. His shouts of, "Poison, they're poisoning us," cut through the hall like a knife, causing panic among the community members who were still conscious enough to understand what was happening. The Coleman family's response was swift and brutal. Joshua Coleman produced a rifle from behind the speaker's podium, while Ezra Coleman blocked the main exit with a heavy wooden bar. Sarah Coleman moved through the crowd with a butcher knife, cutting down anyone who tried to resist. But the family had underestimated the survival instincts of people who had been pushed beyond their breaking point. Margaret Foster and Sarah Martinez, positioned near the side exits, began helping people escape through the windows and rear doors. Despite the poison beginning to take effect, many of the community members fought back with the desperate strength of people who had nothing left to lose. The peaceful religious community erupted into a battlefield as victims became fighters and the Coleman family's carefully constructed world began to collapse. In the basement chambers, Anna Thompson and David Chen could hear the chaos erupting above them. The sound of gunshots, screams, and breaking furniture filtered down through the floorboards as they desperately searched for another way out. Their salvation came in the form of a forgotten coal chute that connected the basement to the outside. It was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it offered their only hope of escape. As Anna and David emerged from the coal chute into the cold April night, they could see the main hall engulfed in flames. The Coleman family had set fire to the building, hoping to destroy the evidence of their crimes, along with any witnesses who might have survived the poisoning. But their plan was failing. People were streaming out of the burning building, some carrying wounded friends, others helping children to safety. The battle for the New Canaan community farm had begun, and for the first time in 15 years, the Coleman family was not in control of the situation. The question now was whether enough people would survive to tell the world what had happened in that isolated valley, or whether the Coleman family would succeed in eliminating the evidence of their crimes along with the lives of everyone who had witnessed them. The night was far from over, and the final confrontation between the innocent and the evil was about to begin. The fire that consumed the main hall of the New Canaan community farm could be seen from miles away, a beacon of destruction that drew the attention of neighboring farms and eventually the authorities from Athens. By dawn on April 6, 1852, the carefully constructed world of the Coleman family lay in ruins, but the cost of its destruction would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Of the nearly 400 people who had lived in the community, only 87 survived that terrible night. The poison that Rebecca Coleman had added to the feast proved to be arsenic, a slow-acting but deadly substance that gave its victims hours of agony before death. Many who escaped the burning hall died in the surrounding woods, their bodies found days later by search parties. Others succumbed to their injuries in the makeshift hospitals that were established in nearby farms. The Coleman family's fate was as brutal as their crimes. Daniel Coleman, the man who had called himself a prophet of God, was found dead in his private office, apparently killed by a group of community members who had cornered him there. His body showed signs of severe beating, and his famous piercing blue eyes had been gouged out by someone who wanted to ensure he would never again use his hypnotic gaze to manipulate the innocent. Sarah Coleman died in the fire that consumed the main hall, trapped when a burning beam fell across her path as she tried to escape with a bag of gold coins. Her body was found clutching the wealth she had accumulated through the suffering of others. The coins melted and fused to her flesh by the intense heat. Joshua Coleman attempted to flee on horseback, but was caught by a group of survivors led by Margaret Foster. His trial and execution became a sensation that drew crowds from across Ohio, as witness after witness testified to the horrors they had endured. He died unrepentant, claiming until the end that he had been doing God's work. Rebecca Coleman's fate was perhaps the most fitting. The beautiful young woman who had spread disease and death throughout the community was found alive, but severely burned in the ruins of the main hall. She survived long enough to confess to authorities, revealing the full scope of her family's crimes and the locations of their other operations. She died in a Cincinnati hospital 3 weeks later, her last words reportedly being a plea for forgiveness that came 15 years too late. Only Ezra Coleman managed to escape the destruction of the New Canaan community farm. He was seen fleeing on foot into the woods during the chaos of the fire, and despite extensive searches, his body was never found. Some believed he had died in the wilderness, but others claimed to have seen him in distant towns, always moving, always looking over his shoulder, haunted by the ghosts of his family's victims. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the Coleman family's crimes. The records Anna Thompson had discovered in the basement chambers led authorities to similar operations in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana. In total, over 800 people had been killed or sold into slavery by the Coleman family and their associates over a period of nearly 20 years. The network of fake religious communities had been one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history, generating profits that would be worth millions in today's currency. The survivors of the New Canaan community farm struggled to rebuild their lives. Many were haunted by guilt over their failure to act sooner, while others were tormented by the memories of what they had witnessed. Anna Thompson became an advocate for the rights of religious minorities, working to ensure that communities like New Canaan could never again operate in secret. David Chen used his carpentry skills to help build new homes for the survivors, while Margaret Foster and Sarah Martinez established a school for the children who had been orphaned by the Coleman family's crimes. The property itself was abandoned immediately after the fire. The buildings that had not been destroyed were torn down by order of the state government, and the land was left to return to wilderness. Over the years, local farmers reported strange sounds coming from the area, the tolling of bells that no longer existed, the voices of children calling for help, and the sound of footsteps in buildings that had been reduced to ash. The official records of the New Canaan community farm were sealed by court order, and the story gradually faded from public memory. The surviving victims were scattered across the country, most of them adopting new names and new identities to escape the stigma of their association with the Coleman family. The authorities were embarrassed by their failure to investigate earlier reports of abuse, and there was little political benefit to be gained from keeping the story alive. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury it. The descendants of the survivors passed down the story through generations, and occasionally researchers and historians would stumble across fragments of the official records. The stone marker that stands today in the valley where the New Canaan community farm once operated is a compromise between truth and silence. It acknowledges that something happened there, but it doesn't reveal the full horror of what the Coleman family did to the innocent people who trusted them. The final count of the dead was never officially determined. The records that Anna Thompson discovered suggested that the true number was much higher than the bodies that were found. Many victims had been buried in unmarked graves throughout the property, while others had simply vanished without a trace. The Coleman family had been meticulous in their record-keeping when it came to tracking their wealth, but they had been deliberately vague about the disposal of their victims. In the decades that followed, the story of the New Canaan community farm became a cautionary tale whispered in churches across Ohio and beyond. Parents used it to warn their children about the dangers of blind faith, while preachers cited it as an example of how evil could disguise itself in religious clothing. But as the years passed, and the survivors died off, the story began to take on the characteristics of a legend rather than historical fact. The psychological impact of the Coleman family's crimes extended far beyond their immediate victims. The very idea that a religious community could be used as a cover for such systematic evil shook the faith of thousands of Americans who had trusted in the goodness of their spiritual leaders. The Second Great Awakening, which had brought so much hope and renewal to the American frontier, was forever tainted by the knowledge of what had happened in that isolated valley in southeastern Ohio. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire affair was how easily the Coleman family had been able to operate for so long without detection. They had exploited the isolation of frontier life, the desperation of families seeking a better future, and the reluctance of authorities to interfere in religious matters. Their success was a testament to the vulnerability of people in crisis and the dangerous power that could be wielded by those willing to exploit faith for personal gain. The legacy of the New Canaan community farm can be seen in the increased scrutiny that religious communities faced in the years following its exposure. Laws were passed requiring regular inspections of communal settlements, and authorities became more responsive to reports of abuse and exploitation. But the fundamental vulnerabilities that the Coleman family had exploited, poverty, desperation, and the human need for hope, remained as present in American society as they had been in 1837. Timothy Walsh, the brave 15-year-old who had raised the first alarm about the poisoning, survived the massacre and went on to become a minister himself. But his sermons were always marked by a deep awareness of the darkness that could lurk within the human heart, and he spent his life working to ensure that the lessons of New Canaan would not be forgotten. In his final sermon, delivered shortly before his death in 1903, he spoke words that still echo in the churches of southeastern Ohio. Evil does not always announce itself with horns and pitchforks. Sometimes it comes wearing the robes of righteousness, speaking the language of salvation, and promising the very thing we most desperately need to believe. The stone marker that stands today in the valley is visited by few people, and most of those who do come are drawn by curiosity rather than reverence. The inscription has weathered badly over the years, and many of the letters are barely legible. But on certain nights, when the wind blows just right through the oak trees that have reclaimed the land, local residents still report hearing sounds that seem to come from a time long past. The tolling of a bell that was destroyed in the fire, the voices of children calling for their parents, and the echo of sermons delivered by a man who claimed to speak for God, but served only himself. The question that haunts historians and theologians alike is how many other operations like the New Canaan Community Farm existed during the turbulent years of America's westward expansion. The Coleman family's network was extensive, but were they unique in their methods, or were they simply the ones who were caught? The sealed records and scattered testimonies suggest that the truth may be far more disturbing than anyone has been willing to acknowledge. What we know for certain is that on April 5, 1852, a family of monsters was finally brought to justice, but the cost of that justice was measured in hundreds of innocent lives. The survivors carried the scars of their experience until their dying days, and their descendants continue to grapple with the knowledge of what their ancestors endured in that isolated valley. The story of the New Canaan Community Farm serves as a reminder that the greatest horrors are often perpetrated not by strangers in the darkness, but by those who claim to offer light in our darkest hours. This story isn't just a relic of America's past, it's a warning that echoes through the centuries. In every generation, there are those who would exploit our deepest needs and highest aspirations for their own evil purposes. The names change, the locations shift, but the fundamental pattern remains the same. The Coleman family's greatest crime was not just the murder of their victims, but the murder of their faith, their hope, and their trust in the goodness of humanity. What do you think happened to those who managed to escape that terrible night? Do you believe all the Coleman family members met their end, or could some have survived to continue their evil work elsewhere? The official records may be sealed, but the questions remain as haunting today as they were over a century and a half ago. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this story as chilling as it was revelatory, make sure to subscribe for more hidden chapters from America's darkest history. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters are often those who wear the mask of righteousness.